Good morning, Title I coordinators. Thank you for joining us for our June webinar this morning. I know a lot of you are probably getting ready for holiday weekend and vacation, so we appreciate you taking the time out to join us. My name is Erin Suddeth, and I'm the branch manager for the Title I Part A Support and Improvement branch, and I will let my colleague introduce himself.
Hi, I'm David Malonti, one of the assistant directors in the division.
Okay, and I've got our presentation pulled up. So as always, just our logistics. We have asked that everybody be sure to turn off their camera and mute their mics just so that all the participants can focus on the presentation. We will have time at the end for questions. So if you'd like to unmute at that time, you can just, type in the chat, raise your hand. You can also send questions to me via email at erin.suddeth@education.ky.gov. And the webinar and PowerPoint will be posted on our documents and resources webpage probably later today or maybe tomorrow. So taking a look at today's agenda, as always, we've got some announcements and reminders. We'll look at the June Title I newsletter, just in case you missed anything there. And our main focus is going to be on what happens after monitoring. So our announcements and reminders, first of all, thanks to everyone who was able to attend our statewide federal programs training earlier this month in Lexington. I think that went really well. We had a good turnout and learned a lot of really useful information from the Brewman Group. Our next announcement, and you may have seen this already, the fiscal year 2024 consolidated application is open in GMAP. That is going to be due on August 11th. I know for those of you who were at the Brewman training, we thought it was going to be able to open at the end of that week and be due July 31st, but we had a little bit of a delay. So it is open now, and we've pushed that due date back just a little bit. So a couple reminders about your GMAP application. Applications are reviewed in the order in which they're submitted. And remember that initial review always takes longer than your subsequent revisions because we are having to review every single page for the first time. I also want to remind you that each of our consultants has anywhere from 10 to 30 districts assigned to them, as well as other duties that they perform at KDE. So please be patient as we work to provide a very thorough review for each district. The application must be reviewed by all participating programs before it can be returned. Your Title I consultant doesn't have the authorization to go in and send the application back to you for revision. And finally, don't forget to refer to the Help for Current pages within the application, as well as that GMAP training video series on our Documents and Resources webpage for additional information, instructions, and tips for completing the application. I have heard from a few people that they didn't receive any sort of notification email when GMAP opened. I believe that was Monday afternoon. I double checked, an email is supposed to go to the individuals listed as District Consolidated Director and District Financer within the GMAP application. So just to kind of let me gauge who got those emails, if you're joining us via Teams, if you could just type really quickly in the chat if you received that email or if someone else in the district did and forward it to you. I'll be able to take a look at that. And if there is an issue, we'll try to get that sorted out so those emails are going out like they should be. Don't forget to check the status of applications from previous years. We've got several years that are still technically open in GMAP, and the goal is for all of those to be in KDE Consolidated Consultant Approved status. All right, thanks people putting in the chat. It looks like that maybe the emails aren't going out like they should be, so I will get looking into that and we'll figure out what's going on. I also know that several of you work with the Title V RLIS grant. I checked with our finance office this morning. USAID is expected to release that allocation, those allocation amounts by July 3rd, and we hope to have those posted within a week. So I know some of you might be wondering where those are. And then the final announcement, I know it's not on the slide, I just noticed this morning. Some of you may have read in previous Title I admin emails that they're transitioning, changing their name to ESEA now. I noticed this morning that I think 2 of my past emails from them have actually gone to my junk folder, I think because it's a new domain name. So you might want to go in and check your junk folder just to make sure that those emails aren't being sent there. All right. If you haven't had a chance to look at our June Title I newsletters, a little bit of a shorter one this month, we had information on evaluating the implementation of the school-wide plan. That's really important, something that you're required to do and something that we do look for during monitoring, as well as summer planning for the annual Title I meeting requirement. These are both school level requirements. Our newsletter is linked on the slide. It's also posted on our webpage. And don't forget to share these newsletter articles with Title I principals or any other staff who collaborate on the Title I program as applicable, homeless liaison, foster care point of contact, finance officer, etc. You don't have to be a Title I coordinator to subscribe and receive the newsletter. So I think you can do that directly from the newsletter, or you can reach out to me and I'll get you added. And you can also reach out with any suggested topics that you'd like to see us cover in future newsletters or webinars. Okay, so moving on to our main focus today, we're going to talk about what happens after monitoring. So during the 22-23 school year, we had 21 districts who participated in some form of program monitoring. We had 11 districts who participated in Title I desk monitoring, and then 10 districts who participated in our statewide consolidated monitoring. We wrapped up the on-site visit portion of consolidated monitoring in April, and thank you to the many school and district level staff who helped gather documentation, participate in emails. We know that taking a part in consolidated monitoring is a very big undertaking, but everybody did a really great job this year, and we were able to see and hear about some very innovative practices occurring across the state. So the question is, what happens next? Do we all just forget about monitoring until the next school year? No, we don't. The other question is, how can we take the results from monitoring and use those to further continuous improvement processes in our districts and schools? So today's webinar is not just for those 21 districts that were monitored this past year. Whether you just finished being monitored this year, maybe you've been monitored in the past couple years, or you want to ensure that you're prepared for a future monitoring visit, the information in today's webinar is going to be applicable to you. Monitoring is meant to be a learning experience. It's a chance for us at KDE to learn more about districts and schools and how they're implementing the Title I Part A program. And for districts and schools, it's an opportunity to learn from the feedback provided by KDE. Now, that could be feedback encouraging the continuation of best practices, as well as feedback on changes that maybe have to be made for program compliance, or changes that could be made to further strengthen your program. So we're going to start with what is happening at districts and schools after they're monitored. I've kind of aligned this to go with our actions needed form, which is the report that every district and school who participate in Title I monitoring receive approximately 8 weeks after the visit. The first section of this actions needed form is dedicated to strengths. So this is strengths that KDE either observed in your documentation or maybe heard during interviews at the district or school. It's definitely not an exhaustive list. Our time in the district, we don't have enough time to hear all the strengths that are happening. We want the districts and schools to examine the possibility of building on those identified strengths as a part of the continuous improvement process, and maybe even consider submitting some of those to KDE's best practices and sustainability webpage. If you're not familiar with that webpage, its mission is to promote practices that motivate, engage, and provide measurable results in Kentucky's districts and schools, and it supports teachers, administrators, district personnel, and any other education advocates who are seeking strategies that that have been proven successful in a variety of settings. So when those strengths are submitted to that webpage, they'll research, compile, disseminate, and promote practices for educators with the goal of improving educational opportunities for all children. We also hope that you look at that strengths section and maybe share them with one another. One school in a district may have a strength in an area where another school in the district needs some support. So we want to see some collaboration there. The next section of the report is going to be the section addressing findings. KDE is required to monitor subrecipients, meaning districts, for compliance, and that is under 2 CFR 200.332D. That's the Uniform Grant Guidance. And you can find that specific citation on page 147 of your Purple Edgar book. I also want to point out that KDE is subject to monitoring by the U.S. Department of Education. So we're not just doing monitoring, we're also being monitored, just like you. Findings are what we issue when there's an area of non-compliance, either in a school or a district. At this point, all of our desk monitoring districts have addressed all their findings, and they're what we call closed out. This year's desk monitoring districts received their actions needed forms between December and January, and then the due dates for any required follow-up evidence were spread out between February and May, just to kind of give you an idea of what that looks like. So once the districts receive their actions needed report and they have findings, they begin working with KDE to address those findings in a timely fashion. And that is what our districts who participated in consolidated monitoring are currently doing. Depending on when the district was monitored, their actions needed forms were issued anywhere between February and late May or early June. And then the due dates for required follow-up evidence have been spread out between April and November. Now that due date range is going to depend on a couple of things. First of all, the number of required actions, as well as what exactly the district or school is going to be required to submit. Some actions can be addressed very quickly, while others may take more time. So we do try to spread out those due dates, coordinate with other programs as needed. So what does it look like when you are working with KDE to satisfy your findings? First of all, reaching out with questions as needed. If there's something on an actions needed form that seems unclear, reach out to the consultant who was in charge of the monitoring visit and ask a question. You can also send us a draft document of something or maybe an idea you had to address a finding just to see if you're on the right track. Providing technical assistance is one of the main reasons that we are here. We also want to make sure that all that follow-up evidence is being submitted by the deadlines. I kind of already mentioned that we try to be very intentional in our deadlines. We spread them out. We don't want you to have an excessive number of items all due on the same day. We want to make sure that it's manageable for you. So we do ask that you try to meet those as best as you can. We also want to make sure that you are committing to demonstrate compliance moving forward. And we're going to talk more about this in a minute. But when we issue a finding, what we're doing is identifying a particular requirement that is in the law or the statute and instructing you on how to become compliant. Once that requirement's been identified, the expectation is that the district or school is going to continue to be in compliance moving forward. And then finally, communicating with KDE when you encounter any issues. So let's say that something comes up, some sort of emergency, and you need maybe a small deadline extension. Just let your consultant know, and we're going to do our best to work with you. Failure to address findings does have consequences. So what happens if findings are not adequately addressed by a district or a school, despite support from KDE? Well, this means that the district or school is still out of compliance. 2 CFR 200.208 authorizes KDE to place specific award conditions on federal education program awards for subgrantees being you, the districts. And that is on pages 126 and 127 of your Purple Edgar book. So specific award conditions could include a variety of things. These come right out of that uniform grant guidance. So requiring payments as reimbursements rather than advance payments, withholding authority to proceed to the next phase of receipt of evidence of acceptable performance within a given performance period, requiring additional, more detailed financial reports, requiring additional project monitoring, requiring the non-federal entity to obtain technical or management assistance, or establishing additional prior approvals. So a district could receive specific conditions for several reasons, including failure to comply with the U.S. Constitution, federal statutes, regulations, or the terms and conditions of the federal award. This does include failure to resolve monitoring findings in a timely fashion. I already said the types of specific conditions are found in Part C of 200.208, and I did just list them on the slide here. Now, KDE may place a single condition or a combination of these conditions on a district due to failure to resolve findings. And some examples of specific conditions would be maybe regular submission of your munis budget reports for a set period of time, say for 6 months. Follow-up monitoring by KDE. We might require identified staff, maybe the federal programs coordinator. And if you've just joined us, can you make sure that your mic is on mute? Thanks. Maybe the federal programs coordinator or the finance officer will be required to attend specific trainings. We may require the district submit their munis budget report and show that it aligns with the GMAP prior to us approving the GMAP application. So it's important to understand that areas of non-compliance that are identified during monitoring cannot go unaddressed. So kind of our takeaway from this slide is that addressing any findings in a timely manner is crucial. While KDE does have the option to place these specific conditions on a district, we much prefer that districts satisfy findings in line with the due dates on those actions needed forms and then continue to demonstrate their compliance. The last section of the actions needed form is for recommendations. Now, this section does not require any specific action or documentation be submitted to KDE, but we do want you to carefully review this feedback and consider how you might take action based on these recommendations. This section might include tips from KDE on how to further strengthen the Title I Part A program. And recommendations could help you take areas where you are merely compliant and meeting requirements and turn those into strengths and best practices. The recommendation section may also contain examples of best practices that we've observed in other districts and schools. So what happens after we've closed out all the findings, everything has been taken care of, there's nothing left to submit to KDE? We like to remind our districts that while we are checking for compliance, we're also there to provide technical assistance, and that's as a means of supporting continuous improvement. Once compliance requirements are being met, districts are able to ensure effectiveness and potentially turn an area of compliance into a strength, like I just mentioned. Now, in order to use your monitoring as an opportunity to improve, you have to continue implementing the new practices after the visit has been closed out. What we don't want is for a district or school to submit whatever documentation we've asked for just to kind of check the box and then go back to what they were doing before they were monitored. I did mention this a minute ago regarding a commitment to compliance. If you don't continue the new practice you've established, then you're no longer in compliance. So the district is responsible for maintaining any processes and procedures that were put into place to address areas of noncompliance during the monitoring visit. A number of our monitoring findings involve districts developing a plan or a process and then submitting follow-up evidence that the plan or process was being implemented. For example, let's think of a finding to obtain parent feedback on the parent and family engagement policy and compact. We may have you submit a plan as to how you're going to do that and then show us the evidence that you followed through with your plan. Now, those documents, the policy and the compact, those need to be reviewed annually. So the plan that you create should be something that you can use year after year, maybe with some modifications year to year. For findings that don't require any sort of process or procedures or plan be submitted, it is a good idea to go ahead and reflect on your current practices and identify ways to prevent the issue from occurring again. For example, maybe you had a finding because some data was entered into GMAP incorrectly. You had to go in and make a revision. Now, that's not something that we would have you submit a plan for, but you should examine what led to the misentry of that data. Maybe you need to add a reminder to your GMAP process for next year, or maybe you don't have a process for completing the GMAP application and you need to create one just in case something happens and someone other than you has to complete the application. That way you know that everything's going to be in there correctly. And then finally, you need to consider future monitoring experiences. Now, if you've just wrapped up a visit, future monitoring visits are probably not the first thing that's on your mind, but you do have to remember that monitoring is not a one-time thing. We use a risk assessment when we select districts to monitor, and the same district could bubble up to the top of that risk assessment again sometime down the road. Now, if you've had several major findings which were addressed, say, during the 2022-23 monitoring, then maybe you get selected sometime in the future for monitoring, and all of those new processes that were put into place have just been abandoned, then that means you're no longer in compliance. And a history of non-compliance could result, again, in specific conditions being placed on your award. So how can you prepare for monitoring? Maybe you haven't been monitored in a while. First of all, use the monitoring checklists that are on our Documents and Resources webpage as kind of a self-assessment to just see how you're doing, as well as a list of the types of documentation that you want to save. We have monitoring checklists for the district as well as separate checklists for schools operating school-wide programs and targeted assistance programs. The checklists outline the indicators that we review during monitoring, and they also have lists of sometimes required documentation as well as suggested pieces of documentation. Some districts have decided to organize their internal documentation system based on those monitoring checklists, and they've shared with us that it really did simplify the process for uploading documentation into SharePoint when they were selected for monitoring. So maintaining that up-to-date documentation helps you prepare in the event your district is selected for monitoring. It's also a good idea to review the consolidated monitoring reports on the statewide consolidated monitoring webpage. These reports are created by all the participating programs who were in the consolidated visit. So it could be Title I, Title II, III, CTE. There's a whole group. And the whole idea behind this report is to identify cross-cutting effective practices, as well as cross-cutting opportunities for improvement. If we identify any opportunity for improvement, we do include some recommendations or common solutions for addressing those areas. And the report is intended to allow programs to collaborate, streamline the implementation, and increase program effectiveness. Similar to the recommendation section of the Title I Actions Needed form, this report does not include any required action, but again, we do hope that you take a look at our recommendations and consider implementing them. So if you visit this webpage, not all of the reports for this year are posted yet because they're still in the review process, but they'll definitely be there within the next month. And these reports will just give you an idea of some of the things that KDE observes on visits, as well as showcase some really great strengths that you might want to consider how you could implement. So moving on to one of the things that KDE does after monitoring, a big one is gathering feedback. And to do this, we use anonymous surveys. We have a survey for the district and school staff, as well as an internal survey for KDE staff who participated in monitoring. Districts receive the survey link approximately 2 weeks after the visit. That way the visit is still very fresh on your mind. And KDE staff have their survey after all of the visits are complete. The survey is a simple plus delta format, just in case you're not familiar with that. Pluses are just the things that you think worked or went well, and the deltas are the things that you think need to be changed. When you do the survey, feel free to provide any suggestions along with anything you've identified as a delta, something that you feel could help us improve the monitoring experience. Obviously, we do always welcome additional feedback outside of that survey. So, if you want to email or call any of the KDE program staff who are a part of consolidated monitoring and provide feedback, that would be great. Our survey feedback is reviewed and analyzed by KDE at the end of the monitoring season. And when possible, we do use that feedback to improve the monitoring process. There are changes that have been made based on feedback we've gotten from districts in that survey. So in addition to reviewing feedback to inform our future monitoring sessions, we also track the different findings that we issue and kind of take note of which ones were the most common. This allows us to determine what additional clarification or support may be needed. So during the 22-23 monitoring season, these were the most common district level findings, and I have broken them down on the slide according to the section of the checklist, and I've also added reference to the indicator numbers. So if you don't have one or more of these items in place in your program, I would recommend you go ahead and start working on them now. And if you need assistance, please reach out to your Title I consultant. So just to kind of go over these, the first one is foster care and youth. This is indicator number 5, and it is related to the written transportation agreement developed jointly with the local child welfare agency. And I've got a link to our ESSA foster care transportation guidance on the slide as well. This is still a relatively new indicator, which is why we're still seeing it more. But if you take a look at this guidance document, you can use the guiding questions and the information that we've linked there when working with the Child Welfare Agency to develop your procedures. That's going to help ensure that all of the required information is included. I'll point out that your district's kind of standard enrollment policy is not the same as these written procedures. We kind of touched on that last time when we were, last month when we were talking about homeless procedures. These procedures need to outline exactly what's happening in your district between you and the Child Welfare Agency. Next is in the homeless children and youth section, indicators 6 and 7. Again, these are some written procedures for awarding credit, including partial credit, as well as diplomas to students experiencing homelessness. And we touched on these during the May webinar. I mentioned that these procedures are related to amendments that were made to KRS 156. Excuse me, 160 in 2019. So again, they're still relatively new. So if you missed last month's webinar, definitely go back and watch that and hear exactly what we're looking for in these procedures. The next section where we see some common findings is in the parent and family engagement section. This is indicator number 1, and that's the district parent and family engagement policy. Now, the issue we typically encounter with this policy is that the document does not contain all the information required under ESSA. Specifically, the policy should contain a description of how the requirements will be met, as opposed to just merely stating the requirements and saying the district will do all of these things. It has to say how. So be sure to use our district parent and family engagement policy checklist that's over on the documents and resources webpage to ensure your policy meets requirements. The last section where we see some common findings is in the fiscal management section. This is indicators 4, 5, 9, and 11. They're all related to written procedures. You might be kind of seeing a theme here of written procedures. These are procedures concerning the allowability of purchases, safeguarding assets purchased with Title I funds, timely spending, in terms of meeting the 15% carryover limitation, as well as time and effort documentation. So we've touched on the importance of written processes and procedures numerous times recently. I know it came up a lot in our statewide programs training a couple weeks ago. Documenting the actual steps that your district takes to ensure funds are spent on allowable items or that funds are spent in a timely fashion are great internal controls. They help ensure smooth program operation, even in the event of staff turnover. We do have informational documents with guiding questions for allowability, safeguarding assets, and the 15% carryover limitation on our documents and resources webpage. If you participated in our April webinar, you know that we took kind of a deep dive into that 15% carryover limitation document. That's our newest one, so be sure to go back and watch that. And time and effort procedure information is available in our Title I handbook. One thing to note about some of the items on this slide is that they are these kind of process and procedural documents. You could be working on those now in order to prepare for the 23-24 school year. So getting all of your processes and procedures finalized now will really help you start off the new school year on the right foot. At the school level this year, our findings were all related to parent and family engagement. We had, let's see, the school parent and family engagement policy. This is indicators 3 and 4, very similar to the district level policy. You need to make sure that the policy describes how the requirements will be met, not just restating the requirements. You also need to make sure that any activities that are described in the policy are taking place. If you say that there's going to be a quarterly parent newsletter, then you should be able to provide evidence that that newsletter is being released, for example. Just as a reminder, our March webinar, which is again on the Documents and Resources webpage, featured specific information and tips for all of these requirements. The next common finding is related to the school family compact. This is indicator 5, and we do also have checklists for all of these items on our webpage. The compact needs to outline the shared responsibility for academic achievement between either the school in general or maybe the teacher, as well as the parent, and as appropriate, the student. We need to also make sure that the compact contains the appropriate signatures. This is a KDE requirement. We want the parties who are listed in the compact to sign that as showing that they are agreeing to these responsibilities. Definitely someone from the school sign it, parents sign it. Student signature is kind of as appropriate. We might not have the really young kids signing the compact. And the last common finding is related to discussion of the compact as it relates to individual student achievement during at least one parent conference. This is indicator number 6. Now remember that this requirement is only at the elementary level. You're welcome to do it at the other levels, but it's only required for elementary. And as we've pointed out several times before, this conversation should be tailored to the individual student. This is not just a general overview of the compact. And this does need to happen at least once a year. Again, if you wanted to incorporate it into all parent conferences, that's at your discretion, but make sure it is happening at least once. Okay, so do we have any questions? I don't see any in the chat. I'm going to check the email. Okay. All right, and this isn't related to the monitoring, but I've got one that just says the district document library in GMAP doesn't seem to be accepting the consultation packets for equitable services. It says the upload begin date is August 23rd. So I'll be sure to check on that and see what it takes to get that fixed for everybody. Yeah, definitely let me know if there are any other things like that happening in GMAP. Right, I don't see any other questions in the chat or in the email, but if you think of something after, you can always email me or your Title I consultant. And our next webinar is scheduled for Thursday, July 20th at 10. I know it's usually the last Thursday of the month, but this one is going to be a little bit sooner. So be sure to mark your calendar for that. I always like to remind you at the end of the webinars that we do value your feedback, and we want to learn what you'd like to see more of, what's helpful for you. So you can use our optional and anonymous webinar feedback survey. That's always linked in the Title I newsletter, and you can just provide any feedback you'd like about the newsletter, the webinar, really anything. All right, and I don't see any questions, so thank you for joining us and have a great day.